And the question now is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the honourable member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, with a level of pride I follow the member for Herbert, because he gave, I think, an exemplary illustration of where mainstream Australia is at as far as bonus payments to the Australian population through the global financial crisis. Look, the entire world struggled, of course, with this new challenge that we faced in late 2008, and Australia was no different at the time, caught up in the maelstrom in September of that year of collapsing international financial institutions and confidence that went with it. Of course, Australia had some predispositions that left us in a very, very strong and confident place, even though at the time we did not realise how well we would negotiate the difficult times to come. In the benefit of looking with retrospect into the way we handled ourselves through that period, one thing is very clear but not often detailed, and that is that both sides of this chamber in 2008 were unified that there was an important role for an appropriately sized, timed and targeted stimulus payment. And I remember our then leader Malcolm Turnbull saying just that. It was not the debate around stimulus so much as the size, the quantum of the stimulus that mattered. And when you look around at the global effort to combat the crisis of 08 and 09, what was important was that Australia was, sure, at the head of the pack, but within the pack as far as one designed a stimulus payment. It's important to stimulate, yes, but the moment you start stimulating your economy more than your neighbours, you simply start to get a flow-on effect where you start stimulating your neighbour's economy at the expense of yourself. And the best example of that, the best possible example of that, was the paying of large, effectively cash transfers to your population in one-off and untied, untargeted payments. Because no matter how well-meaning we are as individuals, we know there are people out there who will purchase large Korean flat-screen TVs with their money, and that does wonders for the Korean economy and their efforts to escape their financial crisis, but does virtually nothing for ours, because all that $1,000 effectively does is purchase a television from Korea and pay for the delivery guy to drive from Harvey Norman to your house. I mean, that's an absolutely minute proportion of that stimulus helping our economy. That's called the economic multiplier. The question that one has to ask when you plan a stimulus package is how much of that money will be re-injected into the economy, leading to greater economic infrastructure that in turn will strengthen your economy. I mean, it's easy for money to leak away to other economies. That helps other countries escape their financial crisis. And that's precisely what Australia did. Now, it's interesting, Australia didn't invent the idea of cash payments that we debate today. No, it was the United States. An extensive study by UCSD, looking at where these payments went, showed that there was barely any impact when you looked at household consumption in stimulating the economy from direct cash payments to people. I mean, certainly not direct cash payments to backpackers, and certainly not direct cash payments to backpackers that have already gone home. I mean, there's no economic multiplier impact from there. We know that people who were no longer living and able to spend money were receiving payments. We know that there was all sorts of chaos around the payments that, of course, were never rectified while this now opposition was in government. The other great analysis that can be done now in retrospect is why Australia went so well. And I respect that the Australian Labor Party will tell you it was because Kevin Rudd was our Prime Minister. But if we ask for some economic advice on why we did so well, there's three major areas that can explain that. And the first one was that the Howard government left Australia in a significant surplus position. And I want to come back to this use of word surplus in a minute. We left this country with enough fuel in the tank to be able to stimulate the economy when it mattered, so that over the cycle, Australia was not going to be left in a precarious debt position. Number one. Number two, we had resilient banking services. Our four major banks are all regarded as in the top 22 AA-rated banks in the world. And we're one of the only countries, together with Canada, that has such a resilient, high-quality banking sector that holds the reserves so that confidence can remain that even when these incredible economic ructions grip the financial sector of financial sectors in the northern hemispheres, that Australia would not suffer the same fate. And finally, of course, we know Australia has that commodity-based economy. I mean, it seems simple, doesn't it? I mean, as long as we're loading ships and employing people to dig the ores that end up in them, we're going to be okay. Well, that's to a point, Deputy Speaker. So long as the recession is short and sharp, your employees, your labour do not lose their skills. If you face a long-term recession, you have the significant risk that people in unemployment will lose their skills and be harder to re-employ. Australia, fortunately, had what we call a short, sharp recession, and that short period of stimulus was just what we needed, had it been the right amount, to get us through a short, sharp recession. Where countries face 3 to 5 or 7-year recessions or economic slowdowns like we've witnessed in the 1990s in Japan, then it becomes more sensible to have significant and longer-term stimuli to keep people working, keep them trained, keep people with their lively routines and not becoming long-term reliant on welfare. That's not what happened in Australia. No, we are still the world's leading commodity exporter worldwide. Sure, we believe about 75,000 jobs were shed in mining, but no sooner had they laid these people off that Australia was still fulfilling longer-term contracts, prices had adjusted somewhat, and mining companies were beginning to rehire again. And whatever jobs, for instance, we lost in one sector was simply picked up in other sectors. And gas is a fantastic example of that, where employment has significantly grown over that time. Australia, it seems, has been able to now, over the last few decades, rely not just upon what is above the land, but what is below. And you may say, well, one day these limited non-renewable resources may run out. I can assure you, Australia has plenty of other valuable, non-renewable commodities that will last us well into the end of this century. And no matter what the world will need next, it's quite likely that Australia has it under the ground. And we're extremely well placed, not to become utterly reliant, not to become beholden, but to use our commodity sector to the best possible benefit of the Australian population now. I mean, I don't think anyone has any interest in leaving commodities in the ground until a point is reached where they actually have no worth anymore and say, gee, I wish we dug them up when they were valuable. Of course we have to go as hard as and effectively and as efficiently as we can to be deriving GDP for this nation and providing jobs to our children that need it. So that was the third element that got us through the GFC. Now, of course, there's been interesting analyses done by the IMF, who took the counter-narrative, Deputy Speaker, and they said, well, which were the countries that truly suffered in the GFC? And I diverge slightly from these cash payments, but we'll come back to them. And what Summers found at the IMF was that nations that were utterly reliant or significantly reliant on high-tech manufacturing were the ones that had the greatest losses of jobs. This was, Deputy Speaker, to put it in another way, this was the iPod crisis. The countries that were making high-tech manufacturing were just the providers who were finding that through the GFC people said, I'll just pause on that purchase of that high-tech good and just see where the economy goes. And they felt the 10% falls in GDP. They felt the 8% falls in employment. And many of these were Southeast Asian tiger economies, together, of course, with the US and some of the financial economies as well that felt massive falls in GDP and in employment. So Australia did well. And look, we can entertain ourselves for a decade talking about, whether it was this government here when they were in that was responsible for saving jobs, or whether, as most economists worldwide will say, Australia just simply had the prerequisites to survive and negotiate its way. But there is one thing that is virtually not debated. There is one thing that you'll find agreement in, from students of Economics 101 all the way through to governors of the Fed Reserve, Deputy Speaker, and that is that if you want an economic multiplier from the money that you spend, it certainly isn't best to do it in open, broad cash payments. Now, payment is one thing, but an Orwellian term, a tax bonus, is quite another. I find it ironic that this former Labor government actually used to refer to paying Australians bonuses. I mean, every person listening to this speech today would say that a bonus should be a reward for top performance. How can you continue to possibly pay bonuses when you're failing in your job of simply balancing a budget? And as I've said before, if you have consecutive budget deficits, which is all that they ever achieved while they were in government for 6 years, isn't that just intergenerational theft? I mean, isn't running a deficit budget year in, year out, with no intention to ever ameliorate the situation or fix it up or run surpluses at some time in the future or ever balance the budget over the longer term cycle? I mean, isn't that just thieving money from the next generation? Isn't it simply saying our concerns are greater than those of my children, and I will spend your money on my problems in the most patronising of language because I want to spend the money now for my political purposes? And is there a better example of this than dressing it up in a bill called a tax bonus for working Australians? It's like the bonus that comes in is for working Australians because there's something truly special in the eyes of the Labor Party about working Australians that means that they deserve a bonus over and above all of that great work they do from a rapidly deteriorating budget bottom line. No, they still called it a budget bonus payment. And this was, in the end, and history will recount it for decades, a government addicted to paying out bonuses to people who didn't even realise why they were getting it. What other government would pay a school kid's bonus and liquid paper out the requirement to spend the money on your school kids? Only a Labor Party could possibly pay a school kid's bonus and say, we don't actually care where you spend the money, don't keep your paperwork, but here is your payment anyway. I mean, if you're seriously interested in having the money spent on the things that matter, you'd have just the one basic requirement to do so. And I was appalled that they rubbed it out. If you are going to pay a bonus to Australians at a time when you're running the economy well, under the absolutely legitimate pretext that you are reinvesting the dividends, say, of higher than expected tax takings, then absolutely return it into the economy in the most effective and powerful way possible. What you have exemplar from the other side of this chamber when they were in government was the worst possible way of doing it, was just effectively paying a pre-election bribe. Now look, everyone in this chamber can make up a story about how hard-working Australians are and how much we all deserve more money. No argument from me on that. Of course, if a cheque arrives in the post, like everyone else, I will cash it. But at some point, there just has to be a conversation about what happens when the music stops. What happens when this money has to be paid back? What happens when our overseas creditors simply say, we're sick of giving you more money if all you're going to do is spend it on tax bonuses for working Australians? At some point, I know we don't have massive levels of government debt, but we've moved from being a surplus nation, running disciplined and regular surpluses and sending a very powerful message to the market and to the global economy that Australia can handle its economic situation, to a situation where you never knew what was going to happen next. A surplus was promised and not delivered. We had ridiculous deterioration in this debate, where it then focused on how long away the next surplus will be, whether it's 2018 or 2019. All you've got to do is vote for us 3 times and we promise you'll see just one surplus in your lifetime. I mean, it became pathetic. It became absolutely unsustainable. But it is true that ultimately governments in distress, ultimately governments that are in utter chaos, lignify. They are unable to offend without losing political support, and they get to that point where they simply can't say no to people. And that's what we reached with this former Labor government. So there it was, leading into election 2013, that almost invidious challenge for Australians and for a then opposition Liberal Party to come out and say, you know what, we know the music's going to stop, so before an election we will commit to stopping these school kid bonuses. I mean, that was an extremely brave commitment to make by then opposition Treasurer, and I back that kind of courage. And I also back that plenty of people in High Street in my electorate, plenty of people living, working and commuting in my electorate of Bowman will also say, you know what, this means I don't get a cheque for $900, but I can see why this government has to at some point say enough is enough. We have been asking now since 2009 precisely when these forms of ill-disciplined and poorly targeted payments would stop. Now, that's not a difficult question for this chamber to consider, but there was no hope, so long as we retained a Labor government in this country, that we would ever see any form of cessation of these vague and Orwellian tax payments to working Australians at exactly the same time that our economy was in decline. Now, I've said before, we had 3 major criteria why we evaded most of the impact of the GFC. The lesson we didn't learn was that our payments need to be targeted. US made that mistake, We then made it twice more. This legislation was the fourth time, and I'm glad that today we embark on its repeal.